So welcome a second time, actually. And we're going to go to Chukat. Here we are. Here we are. Oh, come on. All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I'll make it a little bit, if you'd like it a little bit bigger, and go here. Okay. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. So Hashem spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, there is a comment elsewhere, right at the beginning in Exodus, which says, when the Torah says to Moses and to Aaron, it doesn't mean that literally. God just spoke to Moses. He only spoke to Aaron in like maybe 3 places, and that's because it says God spoke to Aaron, and that's what you have to understand it as. But when it says God spoke to Moses and Aaron, we're to understand it more from a literary sense, and that is to say that Aaron was worthy of it, and that's why it's saying it. It is not, the Torah is not saying it to us to tell us that God actually spoke to Aaron, but but to let you know that while Moses, of course, was unique among the prophets, it says it elsewhere, nevertheless, Aaron was indeed a worthy partner with Moses. Just didn't hear God speaking like this. All right, onwards. Zot Chukat HaTorah. This is a edict. I will translate it as that. And Rashi is going to explain to us. Because we also have mishpatim, which are ordinances, and we have many laws that can be explained in a rational way. But there are certain laws that are considered chukim. This is in analyzing those laws, that a chok is simply a direct edict from the king. It is or the monarch. It doesn't have rationale behind it. It is, I think, one of the ways in which we can demonstrate our love for our sovereign, that we are doing it to please our sovereign. And I think that that is a very important principle for us to learn and to be cognizant of, because I think that if, in fact, we are in a relationship that would seek to be a loving relationship, we have to know that there are times when our partner is going to say to us, or the person we love is going to say to us, I need you to do this, and we ourselves cannot figure out why, and the response is, of course, how high, and not why. And that is a way in which we demonstrate our love. So this applies both in our relationship to Hashem and also teaching us how, in terms of our relationship to other human beings, that we wish to show and demonstrate or deserve our love and our loyalty. Very important issue. And by the way, Shabbat and Kashrut come under that chuk. Kashrut is definitely a chok. There's you can come up with the health reasons and all that kind of stuff, but the truth is, if you do it simply because that's what the Torah asks you to do, and you understand that that's what Hashem is asking you to do. And it is a way of expressing your love. That's it. So this is the chok of the Torah, right? Asher tziva Hashem lemor, which Hashem has commanded, saying, here we are, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, Vayikhu elecha para aduma, Temimah, they should take to you, a cow, aduma, red, Temimah, perfect, asher ein ba mum, which has no blemish. By the way, if it's perfect, wouldn't you understand that it does not have a blemish? So the Torah is telling us we need to look deeper into what we mean when we say perfect. Asher lo ala aleha ol, on which a yoke has not been placed upon her. That's the Hebrew in the Torah. So here's Rashi, Zot Chukat HaTorah. This is a chukah of the Torah. Why? Lefi, because Shehasatan ve'umot ha'olam, because Satan, that is, of course, again, this sort of begs explanation, at least in terms of our modern and Western way of understanding things. So let's just say that there are spiritual forces around, right? There are I don't know if you want to call it mores or something cultural influences or whatever like that, okay? Although in some ways that's taken care of by the next phrase, right? So we're saying that there may well be spiritual forces of which we have no direct awareness. The umot ha'olam, and nations of the world. Monin et Yisrael, they try to prevent the Jewish people from performing this, from doing this mitzvah. Lomar, saying, Ma ha-mitzvah hazot, what is this commandment? Umatam yeshba, and what reason? What rationale does it have? Leficha katav bachukat, and that's why the Torah explicitly says chukah. It uses this word to describe this law. Gzeirahi, it is an edict, milfanai, from before me. This is God speaking. Ein lecha reshut, you have no permission, laharher achareha, to question it. So, so as you see, I made the monin is the root ma'an, to try to prevent, and of course Israel from fulfilling the mitzvah. So that's the idea of a chok. Why the Torah calls it a chok. Vayekhu elecha, they should take to you. Sources Bamidbar Rabbah. L'olam, he says, forever, he nikret al shimcha. This mitzvah is going to be named after you. It's going to be para, the cow, she'asa Moshe b'midbar, that Moses prepared in the wilderness. So that's the elecha, meaning according to you. So for example, it can mean, named after you. So for example, we have Psalms that say, Mizmor le David, right? A Psalm le David, after David. So whether David composed it or whether it's reflective of something that happened in David's life, there is some connection between David and the Psalm. And likewise here, we have a connection between Moses and this particular mitzvah. Aduma Temimah, red, perfect. So they're understanding this as meaning perfectly red. Shetahei Temimah, that she should be perfect, but admimut, in redness. She'im hayu ba shtei sa'arot shchorot, that if you find 2 black hairs, sula, it's no good. It can't be used for this mitzvah. So I'm sure some of you have heard stories about trying to find a para aduma.
A lot of cows, Rabbi, have white stripes on them too, and black stripes. They're not purely red or brown.
Correct. Red heifers are extremely, extremely, extremely rare. I think there was some urban myth or a report of one being found, but I don't know how reliable that is. Unatatem ota el Elazar hakohen, you should give the cow to Elazar the priest, v'hotzi ota, and he should take her out, el michutz lamachaneh, outside of the encampment. V'shachat ota lefanav, and it should be slaughtered, or she should slaughter it before him. So again, we'll clarify what we mean by these things. Here we go. Elazar, mitzvata bisgan. So a sgan is the deputy high priest. And so he wasn't the high priest. Elazar wasn't the high priest. And clearly Elazar wasn't going to be around forever. So if in fact eventually you ran out of the ashes, that's what we're going to get out of this process. The ashes, eventually they'd run out, and you'd have to prepare another red heifer, as theoretically we would today. We don't have any of them. But again, we don't have a temple, and that's where this primarily functions. At any rate, we extrapolate, because Elazar was the deputy high priest to Aaron, we understand in general that this mitzvah has to be performed by the deputy high priest. Chutz lamachaneh, outside the camp, the encampment. Chutz l'shalosh machanot. So Rashi clarifies, this is from the tractate Yoma, which deals with Yom Kippur in the Talmud, and that's the page number 68, and also the Sifrei, right? The halachic midrash on Numbers and Deuteronomy. So he tells us chutz l'shalosh machanot, meaning outside the three encampments. We had read about them in the chapter on Numbers. Remember, there was the inner encampment of where the tabernacle was, and then there was the encampment where Moses and the Levites surrounding the tabernacle, and then outside of that was the encampment of the 12 tribes, and then outside of that was the area where lepers had to go, and there were flocks there, etc., etc. So I think when it says the three encampments, I believe it's referring to the first three, right? The enclosure where the tabernacle was, the part where the Levites were encamped, and then the Israelites are outside of that. So this actually is interesting here. V'shachat ota lefanav, he shall slaughter it before him. And so what is interesting is zar shochet. So what it's saying is that a non-priest, when it says a zar, usually it means a stranger, but in this context, when we're talking about priests and Levites, I believe it means that an Israelite does the slaughtering, the Elazar ro'eh, and Elazar supervises. He looks, he sees what's going on. So he supervises it. Onwards.
What
go ahead.
Rabbi, what I can't understand is that although the ashes are with water and you sprinkle it on a person and it becomes pure again, if we go to the cemetery, we're not pure. And when we come out of the cemetery, we wash our hands. I don't understand that either. We don't have a temple. Maybe that's why. I don't know.
Well, that is why. So the laws of purity primarily apply when you have something like the temple in your midst, in your presence. And so because it represents the divine presence in a particular close kind of way, we have to watch ourselves even more closely to be in the presence of such power and greatness, etc. So I believe the reason we wash our hands from the cemetery is simply symbolic, that it isn't necessarily a purification in the normal sense, although you do purify yourself, like before you make hamotzi and you go and wash your hands. And in that case, you say a bracha. You say, who has commanded us. But when you leave the cemetery, you don't say a bracha. You simply, that I'm aware of anyway. I've never heard that you say a bracha, but you wash your hands, again, symbolizing quite possibly this particular ritual, and also, I believe, to help you mark a transition from being in a cemetery to going back into normal life, life among the living. So I think it has to do with these sorts of things. I may have spoken to you already in general when we started Leviticus, discussing my understanding of some of the, you might say, psychological ramifications of the laws of purity. I think that if one looks at them in a superficial kind of way. They seem foolish or archaic or whatever, and I don't believe that they really are. I really believe they do actually have deep psychological connotations, essentially dealing with the two nodes of life, birth and death. And these are things that we don't really have an understanding of. And so psychologically, they affect us, and they still do to this day. I've discussed the fact that I think that neuroses, as opposed to psychoses, that neuroses very often have some kind of connection to a misapplication of either sexuality or mortality. That somewhere or other there's been a misunderstanding or a misapplication, and a person is unable to deal with it. And I believe that at least one element of these laws of purity have to do with that particular dimension of our lives. At any rate, let's keep going. Velakach Elazar HaKohen midama be'etzba'o. So Elazar, the priest, should take from its blood with his finger. He should put his finger in some of the blood. Vehiza el nochach pnei ohel moed, and he should sprinkle that blood into opposite or towards the entrance of the tent of meeting, midama, from its blood, sheva pa'amim, 7 times. And of course, we know that 7 has the connection to creation, right? To the physical world, the physical world. So there's all these sort of symbolic rituals. So Rashi el nochach pnei ohel moed, right? Opposite the entrance of the tent of meeting. Now he's going to be, so what does this mean? Because he's pretty far away. He's outside the 3 encampments. Omed b'mizracho shel Yerushalayim. So if we apply this now to whence the temple was built and built in Jerusalem, he stands east of Jerusalem. He stands on the east side of Jerusalem, umitkavein, and he directs himself, vero'eh pitcho shel heichal, and he is able to see the opening of the sanctuary, b'sha'at haza'at, at the time when he sprinkles hadam, the blood. Let's go on. V'saraf et hapara le'inav, and he shall burn the cow in his sight, et ora, its skin, its hide, ve'et basara, its flesh, ve'et dama, its blood, al pirsha, on its dung, yisrof, he shall burn it. Okay. El noch, so we had this already, so I guess there's no Rashi on that. Okay, here we go.
So it is the whole animal then, Rabbi?
It appears to be the whole animal, although he doesn't say the bones.
No.
Doesn't mention bones.
Right, and he's facing west then.
Yes.
If he's on the east side of Jerusalem, right?
Correct. He's facing west because the opening of the temple was on the east side. So he would be facing the opening of the temple. The temple was directed on the 4 quadrants, and the east side of the temple, the gate of the temple and the gate of the sanctuary and the entrance would all be on the east side. So
what did he do with the? Oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi. Go ahead.
I was just going to explain that that's okay. That the western wall has, the only surviving part of the temple is interesting, and some say that it survived because it was closest to the Holy of Holies. Remember, if the entrance of the sanctuary was on the east side and the Holy of Holies was in the back, then that western wall would abut the Holy of Holies. So, and of course, the western wall is not the western wall of the Heichal, of the shrine. It was the western wall of the boundary of the temple. But nevertheless, still closest to the Holy of Holies. Go ahead.
What did they do with the ashes?
Well, we're going to find out. You may have to tune in tomorrow to find out. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So let's try this. Velakach hakohen eitz erez, and the priest should take a cypress wood, or yeah, erez is cypress, I believe. Okay. The azov and hyssop, ushni tolat, and crimson colored thread or saffron colored thread. So if it's saffron, that's really interesting because we know about saffron robes that I believe the Buddhist monks wear, or some of them wear. So interesting that saffron has this somewhat universal application. V'hishlich, and he shall cast these, that is the eitz erez, ve'ezov, ushni tolat. He should cast them into the midst of the fire of the burning cow. Okay. And we're going to stop here. I'm going to make a marking.
Rabbi,
Yes.
doesn't Tala'at Sheni, isn't that to do with a worm? The Tala'at,
Yes, Tola does mean a worm. And so that is meaning the silk. So they think it's silk, right? That's colored
I see.
way.
Right. So the what is for the silk rather than like cochineal is a color that's from a bug.
Yes, right.
And that's red.
Yeah, it is. Isn't it sort of deep purple? I saw.
Rabbi,
Yes.
they call what you use in saffron in cooking, they call that threads.
You're kidding. Wow.
I'm not kidding.
That's it. No, that's really cool.
I'm not kidding. I just looked it up
Huh.
because I wondered, because that's what they're like.
Yes.
They're stamens from a little flower,
Right.
aren't they?
Interesting.
Absolutely. Yes. But
Interesting.
they call them threads.
That's
That's interesting.
So it may mean just but the tolat specifically though, right? Tolat definitely means a worm. Okay. So that's why it may actually be a fabric.
Or silk. Yeah. They have some kind of silk.
And shni, I believe, is also a word for silk, if I'm not mistaken. So who knows? Shni tolat. Could be. Of course, depending on what you feed the silkworms, comes out the silk, right? If you feed them mulberry leaves, the silk is gold. But if you feed them, if you're able to feed them like beet leaves, the silk turns out to be red. So it just depends. I'm going to stop the share.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And
What goes in goes out.
there we go. Okay, I'm going to say farewell and stop the recording.